Good evening. This is Maestro Vitello with a Dawn of War 2 Retribution Elite modcast. Today we have a 1v1 on Calderis Refinery, and our first player today is Tex, playing as the Farseer. Farseer is a support, buffing, and debuffing hero for the Eldar. On the other side, we got Noisy, playing as Sindri, Trollface, Chaos Sorcerer. Also a spellcasting hero, but instead of buffing and debuffing, he's more about damage, disabling, and manipulation. So then we have a matchup between Tex and Noisy. I recently revealed that Tex is pretty much my very favorite player. I would actually say that Noisy is my second favorite player. Very creative and interesting player to watch. He's been doing this long tier 1 stuff for as long as I can remember. He's been doing things that other people consider unconventional. I mean, he's been doing it for years. I remember first, when I first got into Dawn of War 2 and watching Noisy, or Pega as he was called then, and he would do a lot of that long tier 1 stuff, and at that time it definitely made no sense to me. Now it makes a little more sense, but it's still weird. He's also one of the best Sorcerer players around, along with Tex himself. And here we got the Farseer against the Sorcerer. This is a matchup I've played a bit with a player called Frozen Vapor, although neither of us are quite as good as these players. And recently in the Elite chat room, I kind of mentioned this, and I think Fat E was actually asking me, like, oh, what do you think about this matchup, the Farseer versus the Sorcerer? And, you know, I didn't lay in about, like, whether it favors any one particular hero, but there are just a lot of observations I made about it. And one of the things I wanted you to notice here is just how the way these two Dire Avengers just DPS down these heretics, and how they pretty much did nothing about it. Now, one of the reasons to go for a multi-heretic build, I think minimally you want 2 heretics against Eldar, if not this triple heretic build. And one of the reasons for that is to deal with Banshees. Banshees are just so lethal, so dangerous, and for Chaos, their universal answer in tier 1 to Banshees, regardless of hero, are the heretics. And you usually want 2 heretics on top of those Banshees. That's usually what it takes to scare off the Banshees. With an aspiring champion heretic, and maybe also the flame sword on the Sorcerer, you can scare them off that way. But, like, I just sometimes don't always want to count on that, because sometimes you might not, you might have your heretic squad under strength, they might not be in the right position. So I'd say usually you want at least 2. Noisy is someone who regularly gets 3 heretics. Tex himself, when he plays the Sorcerer, gets 3 heretics as well. And I actually like to get 3 heretics myself when I play the Sorcerer, in part because I want 2 for fighting, and I also want another one that I can use as map control. And one of the great things about a triple heretic build is that you just get out 3 units very quickly and very cheaply, and that can help you control the map. Because when it comes to map control, the durability or the actual fighting capabilities of a squad doesn't matter. Just having more squads is a little bit more important than what kind of squad. The only thing that really does matter in terms of map control is how fast your squad is. Although for Chaos, pretty much all of their tier 1 units have speed 5, so nothing's going to change compared to different units. Now, Tex did something similar. He got out 3 of the basic unit. He got 3 Dire Avengers, and that is, again, he is getting out 3 of the cheapest squad that he can, and that in part just allows him to have a big army. He gets more units out on the field, which helps with map control early on. Now, so they did something very similar in that respect, getting 3 of the starting squad. Now, clearly there are some huge differences in this respect, though, with Chaos having a melee unit as their starting squad, and Eldar having a range unit as their starting squad. So it's very different, although there are some similarities, just that you're quickly getting out 3 squads that you can use to help with map control. There are clearly going to be huge differences between how you're going to use triple Dire Avengers versus how you're going to use triple Heretics. Now, again, one of the reasons to get such a heretic-centric build is to have an answer to those Banshees, and to have two heretics for an adequate and sufficient answer, and 3 heretics, if anything, for an overwhelming answer. Now, Tex, maybe even part of the reason he got a triple Dire Avenger build was actually to answer back to this triple heretic build. And this is something I noticed myself, getting triple heretics, and then a player like Frozen Vapor, who again, we're not as good as these two players, but he's someone who knows what to expect against the Sorcerer. He may be getting both Frozen Vapor and Tex in this case, maybe getting triple Dire Avengers actually as a way of punishing the triple Heretic build. Because the Dire Avengers as a starting unit, they have speed 5.5 and they're a ranged unit. Heretics as a starting unit, they have speed 5 and they're a melee unit. If Heretics try to approach, the Dire Avengers should pretty much just be able to kite infinitely because they are faster. On the other hand, if the Heretics try to run away from the Dire Avengers can just keep chasing and DPSing down the Heretics because since the Dire Avengers are faster, the Heretics actually can't escape. So pretty much once the Dire Avengers get in range of the Heretics, it's actually just a losing situation for the Heretics, just in most cases. And Noisy would have to rely a lot on just better positioning, pincer attacks, creating dangerous situations, as well as using his other units like his Sorcerer, his Chaos Space Marines, as well as his Havoc to allow those Heretics to do their work. But just the triple Dire Avenger opening is a good answer to the triple Heretic opening, and it's like an adaptive build compared to the usual Eldar builds of, say, getting... Usually there's the 1-1-1-1 build, the Dire Avenger, the Banshee, the Guardian Weapon Team, and the Ranger. Sometimes there's also the double Shuriken build or the double Dire Avenger build. But the triple Dire Avenger build is less common and not as conventional, although certainly there's still some people who have done it. Lux was an Eldar player, I believe, who did it quite a bit. And just more recently, right now we're seeing it from Tex. I've seen it from other players, often as a specific Eldar response to the Sorcerer and or any Chaos hero going with a heavy melee opening with Heretics. Now, interestingly, this matchup is in general also one of the things I said to Fatty is this is definitely a matchup with a lot of high risk, high reward potential, even just from the start of the game. I mean, you have the Sorcerer with these triple Heretics. That is something that, as fragile as the Heretics are, and the Heretics just are themselves a real high risk, high reward unit. They're glass cannons, but they can do so much, and at the same time they can get destroyed so easily. Triple Heretics, you get a lot of wipe potential. You get a lot of potential to wipe squads in Tier 1, and sometimes that can even be the game. I've had situations where I played against an Eldar player, and I won almost purely because I managed to get Heretics in a retreat path, and then I wiped 2 squads from it, and then it was just too much for them to try to recover back from it. So it's pretty good that both these players right now have preserved all of their squads. Tex having to face down these triple Heretics and the wipe potential that comes from them, as well as Noisy just using those triple Heretics and using such a fragile squad. Now, interestingly, one of the other, obviously one thing that's becoming much more commonly known about the Sorcerer is the Sigil of the Rift, which is a very, very hard counter to setup teams. And we see that Tex has actually gotten 3 of them, and he hasn't lost any of them yet. And he's putting them out on the field without even having all of their models, which is actually even riskier against the Sigil of the Rift. So it's very interesting to actually see him go for that. And it's not like Tex doesn't know. Tex is a very knowledgeable player. He knows what the Sigil of the Rift does, what it can do. He plays the Sorcerer himself. And he definitely knows that it's a risk. So he may actually just really be intending to manage it somehow. Just with the placement of his Guardian Weapon teams, possibly even by having so many of them, and hoping to use that in a way that can maybe help him to keep his Guardian Weapon teams alive. He may also just be relying on his just reaction time as a great player to actually be able to retreat those Guardian Weapon teams as soon as he sees the Sigil of the Rift activate. But another interesting thing about both of these heroes is that for the most part, both of these heroes, they have more atypical designs than most of the other heroes in the game. They have more awkward designs where they're not as good at direct fighting compared to a lot of at least the hero themselves, not as good as directly fighting as most of the other heroes. they're mainly spell-casting heroes who rely a lot on being able to cast spells. So that's actually something they have in common. And I feel they're not as good at directly fighting as a lot of heroes, but what they have is both of them have a very, very deep bag of tricks. And it's something that, especially with the Sorcerer, it annoys people so much. The Farseer, I feel like, not as well known right now, just as far as what she can do. I feel like there's actually just been a fairly recent kind of increase in like the community's knowledge of actually what the Sorcerer can do. And I've always felt that way, just that people don't know, a lot of people don't even know what the Sorcerer can do. And I always loved that I could use Icon of Tzeentch against decent to good players, and they don't even know what it is. But lately, people are just starting to become more knowledgeable about what the Sorcerer can do, and it's frustrating them to no end. I feel like the Farseer, a lot of her potential has actually been forgotten. There was definitely a time when people knew a lot of the stuff she can do, and some of the things she can also do are new. One of the new things she can do is that Psychic Storm ability that was introduced in the Elite mod, which is actually something that can be very, very powerful. Now, transitioning into Tier 2 in this matchup, this is a matchup where some Eldar players may try to avoid getting Guardian weapons teams. And the challenge that poses in Tier 2 for an Eldar player is that then they're not getting, it also, by not getting a Guardian weapon team, it by extension means they're not getting a Bright Lance, which means they're not getting a long-range, high-damage AV weapon when you have to manage the possibility of your opponent getting a vehicle in Tier 2. So I think it's smart of Noisy to get a Blood Crusher. He's going to be putting on a lot of pressure because that might pressure Tex into getting a Bright Lance, and that could also just put a lot of pressure on Tex because he'll have to worry again about the Sigil of the Rift. We also see the Sorcerer right now upgraded to the Demon Armor, and that's something you don't see as much. You don't see the Demon Armor, but it's something that has been, again, more recently, especially with some of the changes it's received in the Elite mod, people just realizing some of the things it can do, since it gives you that Demon Shield ability, but more importantly, it gives you an energy increase, which is very helpful. It allows you to cast more spells. It also helps because the Doombolt's ability, the power of it actually scales in proportion to the Sorcerer's mana pool, or energy pool. So the more energy you have, the more powerful Doombolt is. And there we go with a... We actually have... Wow, so that was actually not pulling the Guardian weapon team out, but actually deciding to use it actually just as a way of flanking. So that Bright Lance is down already. Might even still take out this one right here. And yep, two platforms down already. So that is part of a lot of the power of the Sorcerer. And if you notice, that actually wasn't Noisy using the Sigil of the Rift in a lot of the ways that people have come to understand it, which is pulling the setup team out to put it in the middle of a huge chaos blob and then just wipe it out right there. Now, Noisy still used double heretics, but he was actually using the Sigil of the Rift to almost turn his heretics into a jump unit. And I've done this myself, and just one of the things that's very powerful about the Sigil of the Rift, and one of the ways that it's so versatile and has not even been realized just how versatile it is that you can turn with the Sigil of the Rift, you can turn any infantry squad into a jump unit. Any infantry squad. And we've seen that from Chaos Librarian doing it with Havocs. I've done it myself. You can use it with, and you can use it not just with Las Cannon Havocs, you can use it with Suppression Havocs, you can use it with Terminators, you can use it with Khorne Space Marines, you can use it with any infantry squad. It does not work on vehicles, however. And one of the things that worked out there, like instead of pulling that suppression team out, was that Noisy was actually able to get 2 of the platforms. He got 2 of the platforms. He actually kept those heretics in there, and was able to go for another one even after taking out that first one.
We are losing a requisition point to the enemy.
So Tex is actually keeping his Bright Lance far back. Still got this one alive. Now, one of the ways that you can potentially keep a Bright Lance on the field. Like, there is just one school of thought, which is, I mean, against the Sorcerer, you might as well not even get a setup team. And with some races, like, say, Space Marines, that's actually, not only is it very viable as Space Marines, but it's actually a great idea, because many Space Marine heroes, especially the Force Commander, actually straight up have an advantage over the Sorcerer, even with that ability of the Sorcerer to wipe and pull out Devastators. In part because Space Marines can pretty easily actually get by without a Devastator against the Sorcerer. Eldar, I think it's a little more tricky than that. I think Eldar relies more heavily on their setup teams than Space Marines do. So they need those Bright Lances a little more. It's a little more central to their Tier 1 play, and I think they need it a little bit more for their AV and Tier 2 as well. But just some of the ways you can try to keep it alive is you might want to try to just see if you can force the Sorcerer off early, force him off, put him in a bad position. One of the things you can especially do is just really keeping that Bright Lance back, because the Bright Lance does have very, very long range. And the Sorcerer, although you can use the Sigil of the Rift into the Fog of War, most practically speaking, when you are using the Sigil of the Rift, if you're using it to pull a unit to you, you want to have sight on that unit. Because if you're off and you miss, then you waste the ability. I actually forget the cooldown, but it's long. It's at least a minute, if not longer than that. And that's a very long cooldown. And then you have to either just forego that engagement entirely, or just try to proceed without doing that. It's actually quite a big deal if you try to use the Sigil of the Rift and you just miss entirely with it, because then you really just don't get what you wanted or needed. Now, interestingly, Noisy has gone for a second cast Space Marine squad. And I say interestingly, I don't see this a lot, I don't do it a lot, and most people, in fact, don't do it a lot. But there are definitely some things about it that I think are very, very good. And there are definitely, the double cast Space Marine play is pretty popular definitely among lower level players. It's definitely very popular. It's also popular in teams, even among higher level players. But slightly less common, but I almost feel like potentially even more viable, is getting a second cast Space Marine squad in tier 2 or even tier 3, just for getting that extra high range DPS squad out at a time when it's not going to crowd out your composition more. At a time when you basically are just more comfortable with your build, when you know what your opponent has, and it's not as much of an inconvenience. Getting a second cast Space Marine in Tier 1 can actually sometimes be a problem because of the upkeep it has, because of the compositional implications it has. At this point, Tex is actually, Noisy is really going to be able to answer back to the overwhelming range fire that Tex has, because at this point he actually really just has better range. He just has better range units. Individually, these Chaos Space Marines with the Mark of Tzeentch as range units, they are better than, individually at least, than any of Tex's range units. They're going to beat the Dire Avengers quite handily, and even by themselves, they actually do beat the Warp Spiders. Now, Noisy has actually warped in his Chaos Havocs, which is, it's a smart play. He used the Warp Global, and that is something that can be very, very powerful. In this particular instance, his positioning was unfortunately not great, because he's relying entirely on just this Havoc squad as his AV, and he warped it too close to the Wraith Lord, and the Wraith Lord, despite being snared, despite taking damage, was actually able to just walk forward and actually tie it up. But actually, it looks like a lot of things are going right now. We have a Summoning Circle Global. Dire Avengers staying in this engagement way too long. We're definitely going to have one Dire Avenger squad's going to go down. And I was going to say possibly even a second, but I don't think so. So Tex definitely overstayed his welcome in that engagement. He still has this Wraith Lord here, and even though it's unsupported, at least right now, it is not countered hard enough by anything. The Chaos Space Marines, now one thing Noisy could actually do is split his actually kite with the Tzeentch Chaos Space Marines. And he's starting to do that now. For a while he was just running away, and now he finally started doing it. Because this Wraith Lord will actually take some light damage from the Tzeentch Chaos Space Marine fire, And I'm actually like highlighting that now, just that it's taking some light damage. By itself, Tzeentch Chaos Space Marines are not enough to deal with a vehicle, and you will generally lose to a vehicle if you try to do this. It's still just a way of damaging and threatening the Wraith Lord, even though Noisy is definitely not going to take out the Wraith Lord with that. Now, Noisy has lost a lot of stuff, and I didn't catch all of that, but unfortunately he lost all of his AV, but he's now getting a Predator. And this is something that's not terribly uncommon for Chaos players. Basically getting to Tier 3, getting a Predator, or basically just the fact that Chaos, it's interesting because there was, back in retail, it was often said that like Chaos has great AV because their entire Tier 2 is AV. And now in Elite Mod, Chaos is actually a race that comparatively struggles with AV, and it's all heroes. The Chaos Lord and the Sorcerer having literally no hero AV whatsoever. The Plague Champion being a slow hero with only a melee AV weapon. And then even just the Chaos Army no longer supporting AV the way it used to. In part, that's because the Bloodletter changed. Bloodletters themselves, now, they went from being a very high DPS AV answer to now they're not a very reliable answer to vehicles. And also just that the Tier 1 composition of Chaos also doesn't really support the transition to AV very well as many other races. Part of what that means is that Chaos relies a lot on using their own vehicles to take out their opponent's vehicles. So it's often your AV as a Chaos player is your own vehicle. And there are definitely some problems with that. For one, if your vehicle gets taken out by your opponent's AV, then you don't have any AV anymore. And this is, again, not 100% because, of course, things exist like Plague Marines, like Havocs, but usually these are things that sometimes they're just not sufficient enough. There are problems with them, and Chaos often relies heavily on using their own vehicles to take out their opponent's vehicles. Another one of the challenges of that is that if your opponent has additional AV in addition to their vehicle, then they just have more AV on the field. They can support their own vehicle with their own infantry-based AV. Whereas right now, Noisy, again, his only source of AV is this Predator. Tex, on the other hand, he has the Bright Lance. He's actually managed to keep the Bright Lance alive. He does have the Warp Spiders with their aspect, giving them the Haywire Grenade, and even has his Wraith Lord, which is AV both in its melee attack, and it has been upgraded to have the Bright Lance. Now, at this point in the game, one of the things I'm a little worried about, one of the things that's, as much as one of the issues that Chaos players sometimes can get frustrated with is that the actual scaling, Heretics, in some ways don't scale too well. They can't quite, and certainly in terms of fighting, they don't scale as well as many other squads. And unfortunately, I would say the Sorcerer suffers from this more than the other Chaos heroes. There's more scaling from the Plague Champion with Touch of Nurgle, and then I think less commonly used, but still a better way of scaling than what the Sorcerer has, is using the Bloodlust Global from the Chaos Lord, which can actually be used to still make the Heretics a scary fighting force if you actually use that in an engagement. Oh man, that long-range grenade shot with the Warp Spiders. And Tex is actually managing to get this Chaos Predator out of there, and that's something that I think is very, very smart, which is he started backing up that Chaos Predator very, very long before, very long before, basically before it actually got hit by that Haywire Grenade. It was obviously in range at the time when the Warp Spiders were able to get the ability off. But like by the time that Haywire went off, he just was backing it up so much that there was nothing even close to follow it up with. And there were certainly things that Tex could have used to follow it up with, but Noisy had just dealt with it the right way, just moving back immediately. And I think part of that is that he wasn't necessarily reacting to the Haywire. He was anticipating it, and maybe even just getting out of the way to prepare for that, just kind of like a cautious anticipation. Now, Noisy is in Tier 3. Tex, I believe, is still in Tier 2, so he's still pumping out Tier 2 units. Now, one other thing I didn't mention, which I don't recall if Tex has been doing, just as a way of dealing with worship. Now, Tex has not gotten any Rangers, so he does not have an actual detector unit. One of the ways you can deal with worship in this matchup is that the Farseer has the Farsight Global. That's an ability. It reveals Fog of War, and it also detects. This is something from my own experience of playing Frozen Vapor. He would use that global just as a way of revealing heretic worship, and as a consequence, I don't think Noisy has not done a whole lot of heretic worship in this game. But if he were doing it, Tex could actually just use that global, and he certainly knows about that global. Here we go with the Guardian weapon team being pulled out. Now, this Wraith Guard choice is also interesting, and I think it's a good choice. Usually the typical answer to Wraith Guard is some kind of melee unit, or actually some kind of jumping unit, really. Some kind of jumping unit. And until right as I was speaking, Noisy really did not have a unit that was capable of jumping. Now he does have the Terminators, although I don't think they will use I don't think they will actually be using their jump for that purpose. At this point, I think the Chaos Predator actually will go down, though. Yes, it definitely will. That being said, at the same time, the Wraith Lord is itself also overextended. It's unsupported. It only has the Farseer, who retreats herself to save herself. But I think at this time, we're getting force melee from the Terminators, and maybe even some of that Zinch fire as well. And I mean, at this point, I think Tex is trying to come in to save it, just by using that Webway teleport, but ultimately it was just too little too late. So the Wraith Lord goes down, and Tex is in fact still in Tier 2.
The enemy is claiming a victory point.
So at this point in the game... Now, at this point in the game, this is certainly a time in the game when Noisy could get the Tome of Subjugation. Right now, though, I think he's actually content to keep the Sigil of the Rift. He still has 2 Guardian weapons teams to deal with. And I think that's actually going to be more valuable to him. Certainly, he could subjugate the Wraith Guard, and actually, that could potentially be a very good answer to the Wraith Guards, subjugating them, and then using them to shoot Tex's own units, which could actually be very, very powerful. But at the same time, I think still with all of the other units out, the Farseer, the Double Dire Avengers, and the Dark Reapers, the Sorcerer might be exposing himself a little bit too much if he did that. And he could risk basically just getting incapacitated, and of course, I don't know if people recognize that as much, but certainly people who play both 1v1 as well as team games know that it is so much more costly to lose your hero in 1v1 than it is in teams. And that for the Sorcerer, that also does mean that the Sigil of the Rift is actually extremely risky in 1v1. In teams, not as much, because your teammates can revive you. But in 1v1, that is a real risk, and you really do need to calculate your use of the Tome of Subjugation in 1v1, because in any given engagement where you might use the Tome of Subjugation, you actually will risk losing your Sorcerer. Now, one of the great things about these Terminators, right now we're seeing these Terminators, he's keeping them, at least at the moment, unupgraded. Although that being said, I think he can't actually afford the actual upgrades. But at range, they are certainly going to destroy the Dire Avengers. They definitely need to be a bit careful about the Dark Reapers, but I think they might still be winning against the Dark Reapers, at least if they were at full health. It's the Wraith Guard that I think they really have to worry about. And actually, look at the damage that these Chaos Space Marines are tanking. And I think Noisy may be using the effect of both the Demon Shield as well as this yellow cover to really stack that effect even more. And actually, now we do have Tome of Subjugation. And this could actually be really, really bad. I don't think Tex is he's not even responding to it, and he's actually going to lose those Dark Reapers.
Our Farseer has attained level 4.
So that is, of course, just one of the classic ways of using the Tome of Subjugation, using it as a way of basically overextend a unit yourself, so that you can actually just wipe it. Now, in that particular situation, it's tough, and you know what? I'm not sure that Tex actually could have saved those Dark Reapers, because even if he had reacted and retreated, he would be getting force meleeed by 2 squads of Chaos Space Marines that are level 4 with Eternal War, as well as a squad of Terminators. So he probably didn't have a chance there. But that's just kind of one of the creative uses of the Tome of Subjugation that I've always loved, and that certainly a lot of people hate. And I think it's probably a use that was not intended, but just one of the things I've always loved about the Sorcerer is that he really does give you so much room to be creative, and frankly a lot more so than a lot of other heroes. And sometimes people definitely get stuck on what the intention of something is, as opposed to what you can innovate with it. And especially when people are sometimes in favor, want to nerf something, they might say, well, this wasn't intended. But sometimes that's not what matters. And it's also one of the things that just sometimes makes things really beautiful. Just when something is not necessarily intended, but you can innovate things with it that are so much more interesting and make things so much more fun. I mean, I'm sure the intention, obviously, of Tome of Subjugation was that you take control of units so that you can actually fight with them. Oh my god, this is actually... I felt that was actually going to be a really, really smart play. That was really, really nice. That was almost a use of Sigilif that, to be honest, I haven't really thought of, and I haven't really done myself. But that's... I tend to think a little too much sometimes in terms of things that are guaranteed. Things that work consistently. I feel like what Noisy did there was not necessarily something that's like guaranteed or that works consistently. What he was doing was, I think he was just pressuring Tex with the Chaos Terminators, approaching with them, and then actually using, when they were backing up, putting the Sigil of the Rift in the path where Tex would have to back up, so that he's kind of pincered, he's kind of put into a trap, where either he's going, there are Chaos Terminators in front of them, and behind him there's a trap, a literal trap, of basically a warp rift that's going to teleport them out of position. And that's, again, one of the things that I feel like is so awesome, so interesting. And it's also one of the things that I really love about this game that makes it different from Company of Heroes. Basically just the ways in which the setting of something like Company of Heroes is limited compared to Dawn of War 2. Just that you have things like teleportation, telekinesis, and these are ways of manipulating your opponent or even your own units in ways that don't even necessarily do damage, don't even by themselves actually do anything, but you're just manipulating positioning, and these games are a lot about positioning. Manipulate positioning in ways that are not possible and not practical or just not feasible in a game like Company of Heroes. And again, that's just one of the things I love about this game. And as much as I know it's hard for me to, because I play the Sorcerer and I love him, it's hard for me to say that in any other way that just sounds like me wanting to defend my hero and not want him to be nerfed, and because some of those abilities are very, very powerful. Well, I mean, but at the same time, I'm actually very in favor of things like, to be honest, things like the Warp Throw, the Warlock's Warp Throw, which, as much as that's also an ability that people complain about, I love it because it's just one of the things that makes this game so interesting and so much different from, again, a game like Company of Heroes. So unique, so much fun, and I actually do like a lot of the drastic things that can happen there. Like, all of a sudden, you actually can lose a squad, and then it can just disappear like that.
We are guided by a greater force.
Now, Tex is still kind of in this game, still trying to stay in it, but he's he's running out of time, and I think he's committing to the engagement rather than necessarily going for the capture. I think he's trying to go for winning the engagement, and unfortunately that's just not happening. He's got the Chaos Terminators that are basically just going to take out the Wraith Guard. The Dark Reapers got forced off, and there's no way these Dire Avengers can do anything. And I feel like Tex could have stayed in that engagement. He could have captured in the middle of that engagement, and in fact, he actually did it right now. He maybe could have been able to do it earlier, where he captured earlier, and I feel he would have been able to at least get the decap off, which is what happened here. But I don't know if it's possible if he would have been able to get the cap off. I think... Ooh, and I was about to say, maybe he should have gone for a back cap right here, but we have 2 heretics just sitting here, just guarding the VPs. I even actually wonder, well, certainly now with these double Terminators here, Tex is not winning this game, but like I even actually wondered if maybe Tex could have done something like get the Gravity Blade, and if doing something like that, using the Gravity Blade and levitating a lot of these units would have been enough for him to get the VP. But actually, Noisy not capturing for some reason. I don't know why. He could just have the Chaos Terminators go capture this point. They would take a lot of damage from the Dark Reapers. I think they might lose a model, but I also think they would be able to tank it and ultimately capture the point. And he can always have one of his other squads take over the capture. He can always, and he can also use that Demon Shield ability. So I don't know why he's right now not capturing the point. Now he's finally going for it. I guess he's choosing to capture with his Sorcerer and then commit the rest of the squads to actually fighting.
Somewhere we went astray.
Alright. That's the end of the game. Hope you enjoyed the cast. Have a good night.